we used to have a rule at Karambina about no lollies in the school. Now, most adults think, oh, kids wouldn't obey that and wouldn't keep it. But they did keep it because they made the rule. They didn't make the rule for health reasons. They weren't, like an adult reason about your teeth and your health and all this sort of thing. They made it because lollies became a currency amongst friends. And so they were fighting, and there were kids being left out and kids being favoured and, this sort of thing. And they could see the effect that it was starting to happen again, and they didn't want that effect.
Well, we're very privileged this evening to have Cecelia Bradley with us from ADEC, the Australian Democratic Education Committee. Is that right? Is that the
community?
Acronym?
Yeah.
Yes, community.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll let you introduce yourself a bit more in your background. What's your education story, Cecelia? How did you get into education, and then in particular into ADEC?
Yeah, it's a long time ago now, Mark. I began really my adult educational world back in the late 60s, really. So it was part of that whole change that was going on in society. And that was affecting education as well. And, there were so many new ideas happening and new things developing, a lot of which now are sort of, not, highly regarded, but I actually still highly regard them. Things like there was so much more collaboration going on, and team teaching was going on, and walls were being taken away. So physically, the barriers that were there for adults and children were being stripped back, and
back in the days when educators had creative discretion about what they could do.
Exactly, yes. And there was more discretion about the decisions about, what you did with the kids and the learning that they were going on with. And I think all of that really fed into eventually the whole democratic education thing, because that became a really central thing that I really believed in. I saw that it was working in that sort of situation, even in more formal schools. But I also realized that you got to a point where you couldn't go any further. There was a certain flexibility, there was a certain autonomy that you had, but you were still working in a hierarchical system. And gradually, of course, that began to become even more so. And at the time then too, there was a big resurgence in what we called back then alternative education or free schools. In the 60s, a lot of new free schools set up all around the world. And a lot of it was driven by Summerhill in England and the work of A.S. Neal. He had quite a influential book published around about that time, which began to filter through to various people. And I think most people talk about, that being life-changing, really. And so at the same time I was doing my general education sort of development, I was reading about all that sort of stuff and very enthusiastic about it and impressed by what was going on there. And of course, not all of those schools have survived. particularly in Australia. But there are 2 in Sydney that have survived, and Karambina was the place where I was for many years, started in 1969. And Kinmar, which is also in Sydney, started in 72, I think it was. So they're the 2 that out of all the Sydney free schools, and there were a lot of them around that time actually, that are still going. And I ended up working at Karambina, which was I'd been reading about it all these years and kept in touch with those kinds of ideas and thought I was being part of that thinking in the schools that I was working in. And in a way, we were doing really, really good stuff. At places where there was one school where I had a principal who was very, very supportive, and the whole team there were really keen on these same ideas, really. But again, the systems would shut us down eventually if we wanted to.
So how were you trying to push
well, we were really trying to give the kids much more autonomy, right? And also have more autonomy for ourselves about curricula and how we were doing things. But that you couldn't really push beyond the barriers of the hierarchy. And so, but I was very, I had a connection with Karambina that was one of those fortuitous ones. I used to have lots of students, as we all do, I'm sure, coming and doing their pracs and things. It was in the days when that was, much more prevalent, and people were coming regularly. And I ended up with a student who was an older woman who was coming back, starting out teaching late, and she'd had a family and all this sort of thing. And it turned out she was a parent at Karambina, and we got on really well as, working together for the month that she was at the school. And she said to me, if you ever think of, moving, make sure you come and see us, So a job came up and I went there, and I ended up working there for many, many years.
How many years?
I was there for about 14 and a half, nearly 15 years. Yeah.
Was there a last straw for you at the traditional school where you're working that just made you think, okay, that's enough, I'm out of here?
Yeah, there was, because I was in the Catholic system, and so that was, more and more. When I talk about the hierarchy, I'm talking about that from that point of view as well. So there was an educational one and a religious one, and so I'd had enough of that. I'd really worked my way through. This has got to stop for me. It's got to be different. And so that's why it was a timely opportunity, really, to really sort of do things the way I really believed, in a more holistic way. Yeah.
So what does that look like? Can you talk about what is democratic education, or whatever term you'd like to maybe talk about the different terms that are used and what it looks like in practice in school?
It's interesting, the use of the democratic term, because that's kind of come about sort of in the last 20 years or so, about maybe 23 or so. It's getting on for more like 23, 24 years. And so when we were, we did really sort of use more the terms alternative or free, as I said before. But when we started to actually come together internationally, and there was a small group of people that met in Israel back in 93, and they were attending some conference or something, and they decided that it wasn't sort of speaking to them, and so they would just get together and meet separately, and got on really well and decided that they would start doing that every year. And that was a man called Yaakov Herkt. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was running a school in Hadera in Israel. And a woman from New Zealand, Pat Edwards, who is a fantastic educator, and Jerry Mintz from the US, and David Gribble from the UK. And so they began to form this idea of, we should just have our own kinds of gatherings. And so they literally began then the annual sort of what turned out to be the IDEC conference. And it wasn't called democratic right at the beginning, but the more they worked with the ideas, they came up with the idea that, they were trying to link the education with the human rights and the rights of children, and working on the issue of if you want to have a really democratic society, what sort of education would that look like? Would you have in order to create that? And but that's taken many years to be able to really articulate it to that point. It's lots of, I said to Mark earlier, we struggle with definitions in our groups. And it still goes on today, and there's still different interpretations of what this all means. And round about that same time, we set up the Australian group, which has become the Australian Democratic, Australasian. It's ourselves in New Zealand as well. And so it's all kind of come together at similar times. But I think one of the second meetings they had when they were, in this process of deciding about names and definitions, when we had IDEC in New Zealand, we came up with the actual democratic name, and then a couple of years later, the kids that were at the Berlin gathering decided that they wanted to really try and define it, and their definition became that you could learn whenever, with whomever, and whatever you wanted. So that became the most radical kind of point of the definition. And there are different degrees of how we all do that to that extent. But so, yes, I think, that's kind of where it, so there's still lots and lots of talk and discussion about that. But whenever anybody asks me to try and put it very briefly and succinctly, I look at it as having three essential aspects. One is the relationship between the adults and the children themselves amongst each other, that's at the core of the way we treat each other, the way we deal with each other, and that we treat each other with respect and equality, and basically, and we talk openly about, with love, that we're on the side of the child and each other, and the second key thing is about agency and autonomy. And everyone in the school community, including the youngest children and all, has this autonomy and agency, and that they are involved in the decision-making about their lives, about their education, and about their schools and the way the school is run. And then the third thing is this curriculum one, which is the sticky one, which is what the kids said, we want to learn when we want to, whatever we want to, and with whomever we want to. But of course, that's overlaid with all the requirements in all the different countries around the world as to how much of that you can do. So does that kind of give you a bit of a
Yeah, so it's kind of like, it sounds like Montessori on steroids, kind of cut loose from the Montessori curriculum and materials.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's probably a good sort of description. Yeah, yeah. Because you're really intensely concerned about relationship too, aren't you? And
Yes, and agency also,
agency.
but then Montessori also has this this focus on sensitive periods. So children need to be learning certain things during a particular developmental window when their minds are most susceptible to those concepts, learning those particular things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is there anything analogous to that in democratic education?
No,
How does the curriculum, is it
we don't actually
is
have.
it anything? They can learn anything
No,
they're
we
drawn
don't
to.
have what you would call a curriculum.
Mm,
And I think that's the big difference. But of
yeah.
course, in a country like Australia, we have to adhere to the state curriculum, you know. So we try and, work with the idea that if we negotiate with the kids and work with them, we can still cover the curriculum according to the needs of the, bureaucracy, but still allowing that sense of, choice and agency and stuff that we feel so
How does
strong.
that work in practice? Like, is there enough flexibility within the system by doing that to give children a sense of agency, or do you find it sometimes constricting to
I
have to?
think in different countries, it's different levels of constriction and flexibility. I think in Australia, we're not very good at it. But I think, skilled teachers are good at it, actually. They, yes, it's a tricky issue.
Yeah. So if you know the curriculum, if you know the state
Yeah.
curriculum well enough, you're
Yes,
able to pull things from, at different times. And if children show a particular interest,
yes,
then yeah, you can pull in things that,
yes. And if we follow the lead of the children and the interests of the children always as your starting point, then you can do that. Yes. It's one of the areas of pressure for teachers in our sorts of schools. Yeah. Yeah.
and how much influence do children have on running schools in practice?
Well, they have a lot, actually. Yes, all in almost, I think I can safely say almost every, and in some, it's even more so. They the daily running of the school is done through what most places have a school meeting, a regular school meeting at least every week, and they would have also smaller meetings like class meetings or group meetings or meetings for other purposes. But the general school meeting that happens, which it makes all the rules and decisions about the school. Now, in the when the Americans took on this idea of free schools and democratic education, they went all out in saying that the children would have control over everything or be involved in everything according to their interests and what they wanted to do. So they're not
Including
compelled.
HR decisions?
Yes, yes. In some of the more radical schools, they actually hire and fire staff. They're involved in that process. They're involved in as much of, any of the money decisions or whatever that they want to be. But of course, all these places do have adults there, so it's a combination of the two. And most of the schools in Australia have the kids are pretty involved in the day-to-day running of the school, but the adults sort of take charge of the things like HR or whatever. Yeah. But at Karambina, we always used to involve the kids in any of those kind of, safety things. If issues came up, we would always put it to a school meeting anyway, because we found over the years, and, I have a great belief in this, that the kids are actually very, very capable of coming up with very sensible decisions. Many people immediately jump to the conclusion that if you talk about freedom and children, that they just become wild. But they actually don't. I mean, Summerhill talks about they've got more rules than most other schools have, actually, that are made by the kids, but they're changeable. And that's the other thing. They can participate to the extent that they will test the system, and I kind of use this example quite a lot. So that one of the things that we used to have a rule at Karambina about no lollies in the school. Now, most adults think, kids wouldn't obey that and wouldn't keep it. And, parents would put chocolate in their lunches and all this sort of thing. But they did keep it because they made the rule, and they made it for a specific reason, or a couple of reasons, but one that's more important than another. And whenever we would get new kids at the school, they would not believe that other kids would make a rule like that about themselves, about their own lives. And they would always try to change the rule, always. It was just extraordinary. They'd test out the system. And the kids that were already at the school, they would let them change it because it meant that they could have lollies for a little while. And they'd go along with change. But inevitably, they would come back to the meeting and want to change it back. And they would remember, and then they would help the new kids, and the new kids would begin to understand what the issue was too. And they didn't make the rule for health reasons. They were, like an adult reason about your teeth and your health and all this sort of thing. They made it because lollies became a currency amongst friends. And so they were fighting, and there were kids being left out and kids being favored and, this sort of thing. And they could see the effect that it was starting to happen again. And they didn't want that effect, So, things like that would happen all the time. And I had a classic HR, we had a classic HR situation with parents were beginning to get much more worried about safety and all this sort of thing. And because we always allowed the kids to climb trees at the school. I don't know if you allow that in Montessori, but it's kind of quite an important sort of, physical thing, because we didn't really play organized sports as such. I mean, if the kids organized it, they played it, but we didn't ever organize sport for them. So they were always playing other more imaginative games, or, and the trees and cubbies and things like that were very important spaces. And we always had a rule. We did have a rule, which was, I think this was more an adult rule. I can't remember whether it was originally a kid's one, where you didn't help anybody into a tree. You had to be strong enough to get into it yourself. So sometimes we'd have new parents there, and they would help their little ones, to climb up onto the first branch. And the other kids would say, no, don't do that. Let them do it when they're ready, when they're able. And that kind of gave them more physical strength because they would build up to it. And we had certain trees that were easier to climb than others and all that sort of thing. Anyway, we got this ultimatum from the insurance people that they wanted us to stop allowing children to climb trees. And we thought, oh gosh, this is this is really coming up against one of our core things. So we put it to the kids. We thrashed it around as staff and adults, and then we put it to the kids. And they came up with this solution that they would grade the trees according to safety and ease of climbing. And so they marked the tree with a particular color paint. And one color would be for the beginners and the easy trees, and then, so on up through the
diamond trees.
Yeah, the sheer eucalypts that had no branches, the kids could shimmy up, and the kids in my class took on the responsibility for making sure that that paint was always, was visible. It did, because it would wear out after a while, and they would say, oh, we better go and paint the trees, And the insurance company, which was pretty amazing, actually accepted it. They thought it was a reasonable thing. So we never thought that they would, but we put it to them and they did. And that's still going on today, I think.
Wow.
It's so it is possible to really, if you allow time and involve them in it, they actually come up with quite creative solutions to things that we sometimes think as adults, oh, well, we've just got to stop because they'll put so much pressure on us,
So what is a typical day, if there's such a thing as a typical day? Say at Karambina, what does a day look like in the classrooms?
Well, it's probably if you walked in, you'd think it was fairly conventional classroom, really. There'd be kids doing all the usual things that go on in classrooms. And this is what they say at Summerhill too. People are surprised, because Summerhill has total choice about whether you go to class or not, whether you attend classes. That's part one of their, their choice issues, which has been a key thing all the way through. We haven't been able to really do that total choice about whether you go or, full time. We have times of choice, and we have times where they can have more time outside and things like that. But if you came in, you would see kids just doing the usual academic things. They're doing, projects that they're working on, personal things that they're working on. There will be times when you would see them down with the preschoolers, because we have an integrated preschool in it, and particularly the older kids, which I worked with mainly after, a few years of some of the younger ones. We always had the older kids mentoring and being with the younger ones and spending time with them. We do spend a lot more time discussing and having meetings. A lot of each individual group has their own meetings, and then there might be smaller group meetings. The school meeting takes up, a good chunk of time. They have, at Karambina these days, we have a completely free Friday. So they do have that Friday. And they also have a regular, what they call a Summerhill day, where they can totally choose what they want to do. So there's some things built in, but there are other things that would look more conventional. So yeah, at other schools, like in the Sudbury schools, it would be a completely different thing. There might be kids, doing nothing, kids playing. At Summer Hill itself, there's kids just outside riding their bikes and playing, and working in the craft room, and there'd be some in class. After a time, they actually choose to go to lessons. This is the interesting phenomena, actually.
And would teachers at Carambina ever call students to a lesson, or was it completely just waiting for the students to ask to learn something?
No, at Carambina, they would they have what they call inside and outside time, and so if it's an inside time, you're expected to come in unless you've worked out, negotiated that you're doing something else. So yes, but yeah, so different schools would have different aspects of how they handle that. Yeah.
Andy, do you want to ask a question? Feel free to speak up, because I particularly with Cecelia, but I'd like this to be a democratic discussion rather than just me firing off the question.
Just when you said this, they don't have to attend and then so on, which is true for Neil. In Montessori, it's actually not so really true. But sometimes also they can sit around and do a long time nothing, and then they have to do something. But I currently, for example, have a boy here, my grandson, and actually he doesn't like to learn how to read and write at all. And this is mainly caused because his mother, in my opinion, is using from very early age digital devices, and they are addicted to these things. So how are you dealing with problems like this? So if somebody comes and said, okay, fine, and when I have nothing to do, no problem, either I disturb your lesson or I do nothing.
Yeah, well, I think one of the key things about individual freedom, it's doesn't come with license to just do what you want. There's a negotiation that you're in a community of people, and so
how do you make this visible or experienceable for a boy who simply ignores this whole thing?
Yeah, it's really hard to talk about a specific case. I mean, I think if you wanted him to be part of the school like Carambina, and all he wanted to do was be on devices, that would probably be dealt with in a class or a group meeting, where there would be discussions and decisions about how much time that would be allowed in the group, and the kids would make the decision about what that would look like, whether they would be allowed to have set amount of time or no time or whatever, so that it wouldn't be a teacher imposing that. The teacher is there as part of it, and they have a vote as well, but it's only one person, of course. So if the group have got a particular way of thinking, but it's up to everybody to try and say what they really think and what's important to them.
And would it have to be consensus voting, or was it often majority?
Well, that's an interesting point, Mark, because it's developed over the years. It was very much a majority voting democratic thing in the early days. And, one person, one vote. And of course, you ran into all those problems about majority rule, with the minority being, having to, forego some of their rights or whatever. And so that's been a constant sort of conversation through the whole process of understanding what we're on about. And there's much more awareness of the value of consensus and using that within meetings. There's also, I don't know if you know about sociocracy as another form of communicating and making decisions. That's used by a lot of schools now.
Can you talk about that, what it is and how it works?
it's sort of, it's kind of like getting to, it's a little bit different from consensus in that the ultimate decision is, can everybody live with this decision? You know, instead of trying to make everybody agree on the decision, is can you live with it, you know? But there's a whole process of going through discussion so that everybody gets a chance to be heard if they want to be, you know? And so, and at Karambina, we also made a really conscious decision to actively teach things like conflict resolution as a way of, you know, too often adults just say to kids, solve the problem, or, you know, jump straight to an apology when it's not really meant or felt or whatever. And not having the skills and the language, and this is a really key thing about language, actually, in the way we communicate with each other, to actively teach the skills from the preschool all the way through. And so the older kids then actually start to become able to mediate when there are, you know, disputes amongst the kids, and teachers and adults don't have to get involved at all, and they can often solve the issues amongst themselves. And the younger kids will go and get an older kid and say, can you help me, you know, solve this problem, or have a discussion with this person or whatever. And, you know, if that doesn't work, then they come and, you know, get an adult to do it as well, or to be there, or to just, you know, be another person in the group. But that's also another strategy that we've used over the years to develop the capacity to be able to make decisions. And in the early days, and some of the schools still have an extra decision body if people break the rules, you know. So at Karambina these days, we tend to use conflict resolution rather than, you know, the idea of consequences or anything for rule breaking, although there is still some of that. But I think that shows a growth in the understanding about rewards and punishment, and, you know, that whole psychological effect of the group pressure on people. You know, people began to get a bit uncomfortable about that sort of thing. So we've been through lots and lots of kind of work in trying to find effective ways for a community to work, a community of learners, really, you know, because the adults and the kids are, you know, as I was saying to you earlier, we like to think of ourselves as co-learners. I'm sure you have that kind of language as well, that, you know, that they're, yes, and it's not a hierarchical system, and that we try to actively do that in the schools. And at Karambina, we don't have a principal, you know, there's a flat structure about all the organization, but the parents are involved as well. Whereas somewhere like Summerhill, they don't want they're a boarding school, and they don't want parents to be there, because Neil believed that for the children to be really free and really capable, they had to be free of that intense pressure that parents can sometimes put on kids. They had to have times when they had physical space and emotional space from that. But in our schools, we've tended to see ourselves more in a partnership, but still working on the adults stepping back as much as possible, Yeah.
What's the structure of a democratic classroom? Is it single age or multi-age?
No, they're multi-age usually, yes. And so that is a really important, you know, relationship issue as well, and learning issue, particularly, you know, that learning from each other and with each other. All of those things are really important.
But kids wouldn't be labelled as years with.
No,
like
not they're usually names that the children choose. They have their, they choose their own name for their group, and but usually parents usually use the teacher's name if they don't use the kid's name as the name of the group. But that can be different in every school, and they do, because we're so used to this system of, year one, year two, blah, blah, blah. They still try and correlate to some extent, but we also, they move any time in the year when the child and the parent and the teacher feels that they're ready to move into another group. That's when it happens. So it's not just at the beginning or the end of the year,
this whole notion, very traditional notion, that because you're a certain chronological age that you must be ready for a particular curriculum is just so damaging.
It is,
unnecessary.
Yeah.
So how does one train to be a democratic educator?
That's a tricky one as well. We don't have any formal training like I think you have and Steiner do. We're in a few years back, we've made various attempts to try and come up with an education process for educators, democratic educators. And I was working in a group that we began to get somewhere, except that we kept coming up against, the essentials, and it pared back to basically being a mentoring process, really. That the people who are already doing it, they work with the people who want to come in. But of course, you then have to match it up with the requirements in each of the countries. And so if your country or your state has certain requirements that you have to, be a registered teacher. So most of our teachers would have, conventional registration degrees and processes. But we would look for personal characteristics and ways that people have tried to think about their own values in relation to learning and education and children. And we would really, really try and tease that out very carefully, when looking at people joining a school. It is.
So what are some desirable skills and characteristics?
I think you have to be very, very self-aware. You have to really be not. It's a kind of a difficult thing to really articulate. It's kind of like you know it when you see it. I can kind of explain it more from what doesn't work. It's the difference between the people who come in and think because everything is free that they can be free. You still have to be the adult in the situation, and you still you can't just be one of the kids. I've seen so many people fall over, doing that, and the kids begin to feel very unsafe and very unsure of what the situation is. You have to be very open to evaluating what you're doing all the time, constantly in communication with both the kids and your other colleagues about what's working and what's not working. You have to be really honest with yourself about that. All of those kinds of people things that are really, really essential. I think you have to have a very inquiring mind as well both about and keep up to date about education stuff, and then keep matching it up with the core, principles. I think that's one of the things that we struggle with a bit, and I don't know whether you do, but hanging on to what's really essential, but being open to change is one of the things that is very, very difficult to manage. And I think that's on a personal level, as well as on a kind of a general schools or, movement level, really,
So it sounds very demanding. You're trying to, as the adult in the room, you're trying to maintain this environment, this space, but it's a space that's constantly changing and shifting and fluid, depending on the needs of children at a particular time.
Yes, yeah. And you have to, work through your own sort of insecurities, and when you feel threatened and stuff, like when I first went to Currumbin, I was, quite an experienced teacher by then. And, it takes a long time to really earn the respect of the kids. You can't just walk in and expect, and that, you'll be okay, that that you're an okay for this place. And I had one kid say to me that first year, "You're not a real Currumbina teacher," and that can feel quite threatening, if you're not prepared to look at it. And
especially if they can fire you, that'll really keep you on your toes.
Well, it would, and that does happen. I mean, I have colleagues, friends in New Mexico who run a school there, and they get hired every year. They go through a process of the kids, saying yes or no. Luckily, that child did come to appreciate me, but I had to really, learn and change some of the things I was doing. Really, so you have to be, and that's not just a one-off. That goes all the way through, because they will challenge us. They once they feel that yes, this is a safe space where I can say what I really think, they do challenge, the adults. Yeah.
I think that's something that Montessorians are really on the fence about. We'd like to think of ourselves as democratic educators, but a lot of Montessorians will say the classroom is not a democratic place, that the teacher really is ultimately in control. Wouldn't you agree, others who are listening? And I visited, actually, in California when I lived there. I visited a Sudbury Valley school, and it was really interesting watching what was happening. And it was staffed by mostly radicalized Montessori teachers who felt that Montessori didn't go far enough in respecting the child. And that was quite a radical school in Concord, California. The kids there hired and fired the teachers, so the teachers really, were really on their toes, and they just were waiting for children. There was a whiteboard in one of the rooms, and kids would write up, if they wanted a lesson in something, and if they didn't, then there was no option for the adults to push any curriculum onto the kids. And several of the adults, when I asked them kind of in a corner later, so what's it really like here, and they said, well, we can't really do much now because the technology was introduced and the kids spend a lot of time playing. I don't know if they resolved this issue. Maybe they had a meeting, I don't know.
That is, I think the technology, and I don't know whether I answered, well, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of Andy's question properly. I mean, it has changed the scene, and I've not been in the classroom as such in these last, really intense times when technology has really kind of become such an issue. But I know from the discussions in ADEC, it is very much an issue amongst those that are working, face to face with the kids. But it is sort of our basic premise is, you know, to hand it back to them, talk the issue through, really discuss it, you know, and make a decision that, you know, everybody agrees to, really. And then, you know, if it doesn't, if you don't agree to it, then you have to kind of work out with the group what you're going to do about that. You know, I mean, it's yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Yeah.
Did students
But not all the schools are like to the extent of Sudbury. Like I like at Karambina, the kids are always involved in the hiring, in that when the selection panel, which is usually parents and teachers who initially select, you know, 3 or 4 people, and then they come and they work with the kids. And we ask the kids' reactions and what they think about it. And if they're really, really anti the person, there's no way we would hire that person. You know, they have to show us that they felt okay and they felt comfortable, you know. And it's very difficult just in, you know, a very short time. You can't predict, but it's usually a reasonable indication if it agrees with what we're thinking as well, you know, as the adults, you know.
What about the students? Also when you hire, when you register students, are there other students involved too or not?
Not only when that's usually down to the teacher of the group that the person that is coming into. And then once there's quite a lengthy sort of interview process and getting to know the person and their family, and then they come and have visits for a set time, you know, and so they join the group, and you know, it might be 2 days, it might be a whole week, depending on what everybody's decided. And then there will be an element of, you know, the kids giving us their views about how this person, you know, is coping, you know, because they often know much more, you know, they see them in play situations and things that we don't always see. So they have input to that extent, but they don't actually have decision about that. That would still be down to the teacher and the parents. Yeah.
There is not another question, which is quite interesting, actually, I think, because in the 60s and 70s, there was free love, free everything, flower power, and so on. Yeah. And I think it was about in the end of the 90s, then the Odenwaldschule, which was actually similar to what you described, had to close down. And many other schools actually too, because of this. Because new laws came in, which restricted too many things. It was very, very difficult then suddenly to teach, even especially as a male, actually in a school, was very difficult. And even then going over to normal schools even. Yeah, because things suddenly were no more allowed, or you felt like everyone is watching you. What are you doing here? And don't touch it on the head. Don't do here. Don't talk like this here, and so on. So it was getting more and more difficult, actually. So the democratic and the freedom. So how do you deal with this, or what has it changed actually since then? Because I think in Australia it's probably the similar, idiocy, I would say, like we had in America. That then suddenly people saw the neighbor boy changing the diapers of his sister, and then went to prison. And so things.
Really? What?
Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty extreme, isn't it?
Yeah, it was very extreme. As it was in the end of the 90s where this all came up.
Yeah.
Suddenly this was some kind of hysteria which was going on there.
Yes, yeah. I mean the whole development of I think, you know, safety for children and child protection has been important, really. And it has had an effect on our schools. I mean, the kids used to run around without their clothes on, you know, especially the younger ones and the little ones, and nobody took any notice, but they wouldn't do that now. You know, and but one of the core things that when it was really developing, we decided at Karambina that we were still going to hug children.
Mm.
We decided that we're going to tell parents that there are times when your children need affection, that they still need, you know, to just be held, you know, if they're upset or if they're feeling lonely or whatever, and that you will see adults in this school, you know, hugging people. Of course, and we would say, if you're not comfortable with that, then please
right place.
reconsider coming, you know.
Mm.
But of course, the teachers then have to be extremely aware of how they do that, where they do that, and making sure that it's in a very public way, and all of those kind of safeguards that we all now take for granted, really, you know. But yes, I think there were things that we felt that that particularly, the being affectionate and being caring in a physical way was still important. Yes, but it's a good point, actually, and I should check that out with everybody again, whether they're still feeling comfortable about that, you know, because I haven't talked to them for a while about, you know.
The interesting thing is when I'm in Thailand actually, and when I came to Thailand, I realized that the boys and the girls have a completely different relationship to each other than German boys and girls.
Oh, really?
While in Germany, yeah, while they actually stay more apart in Germany, here they are very close together and they're respecting each other in a complete different way. So they're sleeping together in the classroom. But they're respecting each other's privacy.
Yes.
Probably because in their families, they're living on a very small space in one room, and everyone is sleeping in the same room. The shower is just around the corner, where everyone actually gets to know what's going on there. So I think it's probably from the culture, which is very, very different from the Western culture. On the other hand side, Thailand is a place where you're not allowed to show anything, more or less.
Right, yes.
Because you can get in really big trouble here. And on the other hand, also when you see, you said kids were running around naked. You see this here still too, but mostly only the boys. And then boys up to 11, 12, 13 years. While the girls, they put on when they are actually very seldom. They have to be 2 years old and already running with a trouser.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yes, it certainly has changed things a lot. Yeah.
Cecelia, what do you think that there are things that Montessorians can learn from democratic educators and vice versa? What can democratic educators learn from Montessorians?
I think you know, it's been really great to have this you know, group that you've put together, Mark, or you've encouraged us to put together, the tea, you know, with the different groups talking to each other. I think that's been really, really important, and you know, I think it's going to be a really it's got a lot of potential for us to kind of work out what things that we have in common, the things that are our strengths, and ways that we can sort of, you know, participate in the general conversation about education and make some pretty necessary changes, because things are pretty dire, aren't they? I mean, I think if Montessori's could really, you know, accept the full extent of choice and agency, I think you're well on the way to doing that. You could perhaps, you know, gain some confidence from us that it's okay to do that. I think I think we could sort of, you know, maybe you could help us with all the curriculum stuff. I don't know, the way we could sort of, you know, find a way to, you know, that's comfortable for more people. You know, it is an area that we do, you know, have to struggle with. Yeah. Yeah.
how is your hierarchy inside the organization actually? Because you said inside the classroom it's flat. In Montessori, it's more or less like this here.
Yeah, no, we try
pyramid.
not to have any of that anywhere.
To what extent? Also, when you go up, so if you have a president, a vice president, and then you go down, and then you have a gremium here and country groups there, or is this all flat?
We have, when we get together internationally, it's called the International Democratic Education Conference, and it has voted year after year after year to have no structure other than whatever the host of the conference decides will be.
So it's a bar camp.
Yes.
Where you come, and then when you come, and then you have something to talk, you put it on the wall, and then the people can say, okay, I like this talk, and then the ones which had the most votes, then will be talked about.
You put it up and you hold it, and if you get an audience, you get an audience, and if you don't, you don't, you know.
Because this is something what I think Montessori can learn the most actually of it, because in the biggest problem in Montessori is actually in the classroom. We're teaching actually flat. Even the teacher is one part somewhere. Yeah, you find him on the same level with the students, the same. When you teach a student, you have the same height with your head. You try to go down as much as possible, and so on. So, but looking then to the teacher training already, it folds up like this here. And then you have requirements there. You cannot train here. Like an AMI has very clear statement now on every certificate that they are not allowed to train others.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. But because
I
think,
and also in the classroom, like I've often thought it would be, and I went through several years of doing this in classrooms where I would make it optional for students to come to my lessons. So I'd say, I'm going to do a lesson on this, and it's appropriate for students who've done this and this and this. But anyone's welcome, and you're welcome not to come. I didn't say that out loud, but I also communicated that at other times, and it was really challenging. I found it really confronting. It really put me on my toes to make the lessons really engaging for students, and I just couldn't, rest on my laurels by telling students you have to come to this lesson because you're, whatever, you're third year been studying history, so this is your next lesson in a sequence that's in my albums, kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting that in the Summerhill situation, in the high school part, if they want to go along an academic path, then they have to do the exams, at the end of school year. And so if an individual wants to do that, then they're expected to commit to lessons. But that's the only time when they have that rule. So if it takes you 1 year or 2 years to do it or whatever, you then do have to. So the teachers are pretty much guaranteed that, I've got X number of kids that are going to do the exams, and so they will turn up for lessons, But in other situations, it varies. It's, it's different. And quite often, when Currumbina has its Summerhill days where there's total choice, the kids actually run the lessons. They'll put up things and say, I'm going to do this, or so they will get, do stuff as well. It's not just the adults doing it. But that doesn't happen every day, so I don't want to give the wrong impression. I mean, there's still some fairly conventional stuff going on as well, particularly in Australian schools,
Cecelia, it's been so fascinating talking to you. I could continue this conversation for hours, I'm sure. And if people would like to hear more about democratic education, we're having a democratic speaker at the conference in October in Sydney. So to hear more about the perspective of democratic education on transforming the adult and how to do that. So thank you again for your time this evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, Mark, and thank you to all of you, for being here as well. Can I just say we've got a brand new ADEC website, which, you know, if you want to have a look for the Australian scene, I handed over being president of that at the end of last year, after many, many years. And there's a whole lot of new energy happening, which is fantastic, you know. So it's just adec.edu.au if you want to have a look at it. Yeah.
ADEC.
Yes, adec.edu.au. Yeah. Yeah.
ed.au. Okay.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for, you know, creating this opportunity for our different systems to get together. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Really is, isn't it, Cecelia? It's so good.
Yes. Hello,
Yeah.
Alex. I didn't realize that was you.
Hello.
You were very quiet today.
I know, it's good for me to be quiet. Yeah, really enjoyed it. It was great.
Good.
Thanks, Cecelia.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
See you in a couple of
Thanks.
weeks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
see you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.